Hey, Brenna, thanks for joining me today. You're on mute. We have to begin every conversation with that, don't we, on any Zoom-like encounter. No, I really appreciate you taking the time to come hang out with us today and talk about what you do. And before we dive into that, it's such an interesting world we live in because in past worlds, a year plus ago, we would just reach out to our local community for answers to things. But the beauty of the internet is I can talk to someone in Montana and learn from their insight, or I can talk to someone in California, and we just have so much knowledge we can share. And as I mentioned when we first talked, in craft beer professionals, we really try to draw attention to the humanizing topics in the craft beer industry that can make us better as people, and in turn will make us better as an industry. And there's been some unfortunate incidents in the industry recently regarding the treatment of, women in the industry, regarding sexual harassment and other unfortunate encounters. And someone had reached out to us about your organization and Make Your Move Missoula. You're obviously based in Montana, but can you tell us a little bit more about what you do?
Yeah, so Make Your Move Missoula is based in Missoula, Montana, which is one of the larger cities here in Montana. And we provide a plethora of prevention education trainings for workplaces, for bars, breweries, distilleries, and other alcohol serving establishments, and then also for our nightlife scene. So comedians, event promoters, venues, and musicians.
I would imagine your role has changed quite a bit through the pandemic.
Oh, yeah, it's been lots of fun. Uh, and I think it's given us time to, do workshops like this where we're able to be virtual and connect with folks across the country and at different times of day that we normally wouldn't be doing so.
Absolutely. Well, I appreciate you once again taking the time today. And I'm going to pass the screen to you. I'm going to get out of your hair. We're going to pull up your slides. I'm going to let you provide some insight to the rest of us. We're really excited to learn today. And thanks again.
Awesome. Thanks for having me. So, as Andrew mentioned, my name is Brenna and I coordinate the Make Your Move Council. The Make Your Move Council in Missoula is comprised of a few different agencies that focus on victim services and sexual violence and domestic violence prevention. So that includes the YWCA of Missoula, Missoula City County Relationship Violence Services, our public health department, and the Student Advocacy Resource Center at the University of Montana. And so we, come together, and our aim is really to end sexual harassment and sexual assault in our community. And the key kind of reason for that, or the reason that we do this work, is because, and now I can't make this slide go. There we go. Because sexual violence can be prevented. And I think if you leave this workshop only with one thing, my hope is that folks understand that sexual harassment and sexual assault, sexist jokes, unwanted touch, all of these things don't have to exist. We can live in a society, in a community, in a town where sexual harassment and assault does not happen. And that, I think, sometimes can feel mind-boggling, like not in a good way, right? Like sometimes I wake up in the morning and I think like, oh my gosh, I have to solve rape. That is my day job. And that can be super overwhelming. And so I don't mean to overwhelm any of you, but I do really think it is important to recognize the way that we all have a role to play in creating a space that is more inclusive, more caring, and more receptive to people's needs so that harm happens less often and eventually stops happening. And so today I'm going to talk a little bit about why sexual violence and harassment prevention specifically is beneficial to your career development and ways that you can utilize bystander intervention to respond to harm. This is going to be pretty interactive, so if you are able to, I would love for you to add in the comments some answers to my questions. otherwise there'll be some dead air and I'll make funny faces before we move on. So when we're thinking of advancing your career, the reason why I'm providing this framework is because I do not find a lot of joy in going to a business or a workplace or a classroom and being like, sexual harassment sucks, let's stop doing that. That's no fun for me, and it's probably not fun for you all. But what is really exciting is thinking about how to make your professional career grow, how to really improve the establishment that you work in. Like, I think none of you are in craft brewery because like you want to have a crummy place for people to visit, right? Like, I think that everyone in this industry is really invested in making a fun and safe and enjoyable place for people to have a good time and have something good to drink. And so that is really what I hope today focuses on, is really being able to pair that joy and excitement with also that knowledge that we all have a role in prevention and we can all make a positive change. So here is the start of the comment section. I am curious what skills and attributes you bring to your workplace. You could also tell me like what makes your brewery such an awesome brewery to be at or to work for or to run. I'll give you a few seconds to type. As you're typing, some attributes and skills that when I've done, oops, that text box in the wrong place. But when I've done this before with folks, some of those attributes have been a fun place to work. Some of those attributes have been things like professional growth response opportunities, or promotions. Sometimes the reasons people like a good workplace or like their workplace are for flexible hours. It's for the good customers, fun regulars. If any of you have establishments that include performance, like music or comedy, that's often a reason to love your workplace. The list can go on and on. What I do want you to think about, though, is really maybe even just jot it down for yourself. What skills do you bring to this work? What do you look for in a job? And why do you celebrate your organization? And these are key because I think that you and I are after the same thing. When I talk about wanting, sexual harassment prevention, it's not that I want to go in and police people and be like, hey, let's make sure you're grinding a certain amount apart. Or, I don't have any interest in that sort of management. What I do have an interest in is being able to create that fun space, create a place where customers want to come back and return to. I want customer loyalty and to be like seen as a community leader, right? And so all of these things are both beneficial to you as a brewer and also in the realm of creating a safer community. And so then I want you to think a little bit about how sexual harassment impedes your career development. Again, I'm going to give you a few seconds to type in case you want to. And if you're not typing, remember to hydrate. Drinking water is great. So, how does sexual harassment impede your career? I think some of the ways that are often top of mind for folks are things like the way that if I am the recipient of harassment, it makes it more difficult for me to come to work, right? If you are the person who is causing the harassment, it may mean that you don't have a successful career. For instance, we know from the popularization of the Me Too movement that when folks in the entertainment industry were called out for sexual harassment or sexual assault, they lost some amount of influence in their industry. And the same thing can happen in our cities and towns. And so if we are people who are perpetrating harm, that may impact our career growth. And then the other key element I want you all to think about is the way that, even if you're not the one who is being harassed, and even if you're not the person harassing, that the fact that harassment exists still can create a space where being at work is not fun, or trust is low, rapport building is low. It can really impact team dynamics. In addition to working with alcohol serving establishments, I also work with trail crews who go out into the mountain with heavy machinery and cut stuff down. And there are studies that show when trust and rapport are low, that is a higher indicator of harm happening, like tool harm happening, hazards in the workplace, than like misusing a chainsaw, right? And that certainly is similar in different industries as well, where being able to being able to respond to harm and show that we care for our coworkers is really going to build that rapport. And when harm happens and is not responded to, that diminishes, and therefore the whole team can kind of fall apart. Also, if you have any questions, you are more than welcome to add them in the chat. And so what I want to spend, excuse me, the majority of our time together today talking about is how to make this workplace feel like one where it is safe to talk about or report harassment. And that can be the workplace that we have or you all have as bar staff and brewery staff. And it can also be the way that patrons can seek out support. And so for us to get to this point in the conversation, I want to do the boring part, which is to talk about what exactly is harassment. By law, there are three different parts of, or three different ways that harassment can happen. One is when it's pervasive, the other is when it's severe, and the third is when it's transactional. Pervasive harassment is going to be harassment that is ongoing. So if Andrew were to show up and I were to comment on his body today, and then I were to do that tomorrow, and then I were maybe going to take a break, but then in 3 weeks I'm going to do it, and then in 4 weeks I'm going to do it, and then on Thursday, Friday, and Saturday of 5 weeks from now I'm going to do it, that becomes pervasive, right? Because it is, even though it's not necessarily consistent, sometimes it can be, but it is ongoing. And all my attempts to ask for repair or ask for that behavior to stop are not being met. And so that is one form of harassment. I think thinking of pervasive as a definition is really helpful, because sometimes I think that we conflate what is flirting versus what is harassment. Flirting means that I'm going up to someone who I think is sexy and I'm like, hey, and hopefully they're like, hey, back. And if they are, I probably know because they're smiling and they're leaning closer. And I'm like, can I have your number? And they're like, yes, please call me. Like, there's some reciprocity in both their body language and in what they are communicating verbally. If I were to go up to someone and be like, hey, you look fine, and they're like, sorry, I'm like not into that. Or if they're like, oh, thanks, and there's clear communication that that flirtation is not wanted, that one moment of flirtation, that's not illegal. What is if I were then to continue that behavior, if I were to do that, notice discomfort from someone, and then choose to continue. Choose to either say like, oh, but can I get your number? Oh, but you look so good. Oh, but don't you want to come home with me? Or to say, oh, you look so fine today, and notice that discomfort. And then tomorrow say, oh, you look so fine, and notice some more discomfort. And maybe a few weeks from now, say it again and get a verbal, like, hey, please stop, and continue, right? All of these, it's the repeat of the behavior that makes it harmful. That said, there are times when a one-time thing does legally count as harassment. And that is when it falls under something that is called severe harassment. Excuse me. So severe harassment is going to be when it is so intense that in that very moment, it creates a hostile environment or like a really uncomfortable or harmful place to be. This would be, for instance, if someone made a comment about, you know, like, oh gosh, like if I were to say, Andrew just said stop picking on him, but I'm going to pick on him one more time, which is, saying like, hey, I want to do this very sexually explicit thing to you. And I say this while we are in like the cooler room and it feels like there's no exit. And Andrew has reason to be very fearful. That can be severe enough, even though it's one time, that can be severe enough because it is so explicit, because the setting makes exiting more difficult, things like that. And then there's the last piece, which is transactional. And that is what in Latin is called quid pro quo. So that would be me saying, hey, can I get a raise? And my boss being like, yeah, if you give me a blowjob. Or being like, hey, you keep like saying these really uncomfortable things to me. Can you stop? And then someone being like, yeah, I'll stop, but if you tell anyone, like, I'm gonna get you fired, right? So it's this idea of harm happening, where the person who's receiving harm has to make this choice to be the recipient of harm in order to have a positive outcome or not to have negative outcomes happen to them. Under US law, harassment includes more than just sexual harassment. So it includes things like harassment based on age, marital status, disability, national origin, veteran status, genetic information, race, and creed. My focus today is really going to be on sexual harassment, which is going to focus on like sexism more than gender discrimination, though gender discrimination is often something that is also incorporated in sexual harassment. I also have at the end of this slide retaliation in parentheses because retaliation is also illegal. So if you were to go to your boss or to HR or file a suit with your local human resource council, if then you experienced bad workplace environment because you filed a complaint, that in and of itself becomes harassment and is illegal. This is just a quote. You can screenshot it from one of the organizations I work with a lot, the Montana Conservation Corps Trail Crew. This is part of their policy. What I really like about this is that they support people who are reporting more often than they support the person being accused. I think this is really important because, especially in workplaces, it can be very, very, very difficult to report when harm is happening. And to be able to write in their policy, like, hey, if it was unwelcomed and the recipient was uncomfortable, we're going to assume that it was harassment. We're going to assume that it was bad behavior. And just really trusting their employees is something that I quite love about this policy. We'll skip over this, but just know that consent means that you have to be able to agree, but that also includes wanting, joy, and also ethics. And so when we talk about ethics, it's really thinking about what is my role as the manager of this brewery, or as the owner, or as the closing lead, as the most recently hired staff member. Like, what is my role in this establishment, and how does that make me flirting or like deciding to pursue consensual things with coworkers or customers different? I think about, I as a patron at breweries, think of this question for me of, is it ethical for me to hit on my bartender? And sometimes if I maybe know this bartender from other places, maybe I'll say, okay, but maybe I'll hit on them not at work, not while they're at work. There's also the thought of me as a customer, am I going to choose to do this when a bartender does not have an out, right? Like, you got to stay at the bar, you got to stay at the establishment. If I as a customer hit on an employee, how is that going to impact their experience at their job? And so really thinking about, is it ethical, is something that I hope everyone thinks about. Employees, managers, and customers. Great. And so at the end of the day, the difference between flirting and harassment are often things like relationship, the setting, the power, and the impact. So this is things like, how well established do I have a relationship with this person? Do I know them? Do we have a good communication style that ensures that if they want to reject my advances, that they can? All those things are going to lead to it being more successful flirting than harassment. similarly settings. So this is what I was getting at with like a bartender's at the bar at work. Like, are we, or earlier when I was like, oh, we're like in the walk-in cooler. Are there settings that make refusal more difficult? Are there ways to ensure that people have a greater ability to say no or to say yes because it is more freely given? There's also questions about power. And power can be like very hierarchical, like in the structure of an organization. So, what are the power impacts of a boss hitting on a staff member? But also thinking about power as the fact that not all not all harassment is like a mess up of flirting, right? There there are times when the reason people harass others is not because they were genuinely trying to build connection and it landed wrong. More often, it is that there is a disinterest in the feelings of the recipient, or that there is a certain amount of like joy or satisfaction from being able to know that you are making someone else uncomfortable. And so those both of those pieces are about power. And then again, thinking about this impact piece, and that at the end of the day, you know, I could say something flirty to my friend and something flirty to my coworker, and one of those people might feel really okay with it, and another person might feel not okay with it. And then at the end of the day, it's like up to them to be able to identify whether or not that harm happened. And then it's on me to repair that harm and try to make things better. So when I train bars, we focus on 4 different pieces. One is really talking about what is sexual harassment and assault. One is looking at policy. The third is intervention skills. And the fourth is working with law enforcement. Um, I am more than happy to offer technical assistance if there is a sexual violence prevention education agency in your community. We offer this curriculum for free to those agencies so that they can provide it in your locality. To find out more, you can go to makeyourmovemissoula.org. I'm just going to briefly go over a little bit about sexual violence in Missoula, specifically in our nightlife. So this is focusing on bars and breweries and distilleries within our county. Our county has about the geographic size of Delaware and the population of about 150,000 people. So there's a very populated core and then a very sparse kind of rural segment of our county. To start off with, though, I want to talk about this study that was done in Toronto. And it focused on sexual aggression in bars. They sent out researchers and had them watch for when sexual aggression was happening. And 90% of the aggression that was happening was men targeting women. This means that the other 10% was women targeting men, men targeting men, women targeting women. Non-binary people, I'm pretty sure, were not even included in this study. And I also recognize that there are ways that we are socialized to be more aware of harm, of sexual violence happening against women than we are other people. So this is not 100% like solid fact, but it is helpful to know. What I find most important in this study is that the people who were being aggressive were not aggressive because they had too much to drink. They were able to kind of watch and tally how much alcohol folks were consuming. And actually, the people who were being aggressive were often more sober than the person that they were targeting. And this was the case even if the person being targeted was similarly-ish sober, but appeared intoxicated. So the more like expressive, goofy, loud, drunk seeming people were, the more likely that they are to be the recipients of aggression. This is really important to me because I think there are times when culturally we write off people's bad behavior, people's aggression for being intoxicated. I think a trope, for instance, is you go home for Thanksgiving dinner and, Uncle Joe is just gonna like get super drunk and say something racist. It's not necessarily that Uncle Joe is drunk. And that is the same case here. It's not necessarily that these people are so intoxicated and so they're not on their best behavior and so they are just saying terrible things or harassing things. Instead, it is a bit more intentional. Again, it's about that ability to manipulate, to get away with things. And so for that reason, making sure that you are meeting the requirements of safe alcohol sales and service and not serving to folks who are incredibly intoxicated actually then reduces the number of people present who someone may choose to harm. The other key part of this study is that staff rarely intervened. There are potentially a lot of reasons for that, right? It can be the environmental setup of the bar, like if the bar is facing one direction and the harm is happening down the hallway. There's also the fact that at least a lot of establishments we work for are not like staffed with 1 million people. And so you have a lot of customers to respond to in any given moment. However, that then leaves most of the intervention to third parties. And sometimes those third parties are like friends, random strangers, and they don't always like intervene in the ways we'd want them to. There are times where people are like, hey, don't do that, stop doing that. And then there were times in the study where they encouraged the behavior. So like laughed along, joined in, supported the person performing these acts of aggression. So we did a study in Missoula in 2017. We asked county bar goers what their experience was at any alcohol serving establishment. And we got a lot of really cool data. Again, this is something that we can help you replicate with support of your sexual violence prevention educators in your community. We found out some reasons why people go out. The majority is to hang out with friends, to have good food, to listen to live music, and to go dancing. We learned why people are loved. This is one of our bars. And this bar in particular is loved because they play Packers games. They have family-friendly nights. They also have really great late night music as well. But then we also asked folks what their experiences of verbal harassment or physical altercations were. And 94% of the 321 people who responded experienced at least one incident targeted towards them of verbal harassment or a physical altercation. This is a big number. And when I show this to folks in bars, I'd love to know your own reactions if you want to add to the comments. But when I show this to folks locally, One of the pieces of feedback we get is that this number is really low. The 84% feels super low. And that instead it could possibly be closer to 100. And when I go back to thinking of sexual violence can be prevented at the beginning, and then I think of how high this number is, it definitely can feel intense or insurmountable for how we can create change. But for me, I think, the first step is to acknowledge that this is the water we're swimming in, right? This is the state of things. And it's our role to be able to understand that this harm is happening. When we divided this up, people could select more than one. So you'll see the percentages on the side equal more than 100. But sexist comments and unwanted sexual touch were the top 2 types of harm or harassment that occurred. This seemed, from our data, pretty consistent between men, women, and non-binary community members. There are also things like having things slipped into your drink. 15% of people reported that happening to them at least once. And so really recognizing that, the harm happens and it sucks. And so I am now going to show some verbal examples of what they are. This includes things like, a lot of times I see women completely blackout drunk at the bars and see sober-looking men groping them. I never see anyone bat an eye, and to me, that's a little unsettling. It's fights, grabbing on women and men in a sexual manner when the person was told to stop. Guys getting gals so drunk that the gal can barely walk out of the door. And basically it's just, oh, well, it's a college town. My friend was blacked out and was forced into oral sex at a bar. There have been several times where a man has walked past my friend and I and grabbed our chests or butts before disappearing into the crowd. When that happens, it's hard for them to be found to receive the repercussions that they deserve. Oops. Oh, I guess that's the end of my presentation. I didn't think it was. So I think what I want to do now is take, hold up one second. Let me save. Hi, everyone. Oh, zoomed over my face. Let me see if I can find the rest of this presentation. Here we are. So I want to quickly talk about some basic bystander strategies, and then I want to open up the rest of the time for some conversation and questions. So let me share this screen and hope this works. There we go. Okay. So when we think of bystander intervention, I want us to first think about the goals that we have when intervention happens. And that is really focusing on what you hope to accomplish. And sometimes these goals are different. Like sometimes they go alongside each other pretty well, and sometimes they don't. For instance, the goal of wanting to get good tips that day may be contradictory to the goal of wanting to help a customer be safe. And in that binary, I hope that we all would pick keeping a customer safe. But that doesn't mean that we're still not giving up something, right? Like, I want to acknowledge that sometimes doing the right thing means giving up stuff. There are times when we may want to be a cool chill establishment, and addressing an altercation in the way that we think is most important may lead to a louder verbal altercation than maybe we want. There are also times when I think we can balance out wanting to educate the person who's doing harm, be like, hey, like, we don't really do that in our brewery. Could you not make comments like that? With like wanting to shut something down, with wanting to shame someone and be like, you suck for making these comments to my staff. Get out of here. Like that, again, sometimes all these goals align and sometimes they don't. And so just being able to recognize what it is that you're trying to accomplish with bystander intervention is one of the key points or key parts of it. When I am talking about bystander intervention, there are about 1,000,005 different strategies that you can use. Here are 6. This comes from an organization called A Call to Men. And the 6 they list here, one is make it relatable. So that's like saying, hey, that was a really uncomfortable comment to make. Like, my mom also has boobs. Would you say that to her? That's a bad example, but I hope you get what I mean. Using I statements would be something like, hey, I felt really uncomfortable when you called that person a faggot. Like, could you not? Adding humor could be something like, my go-to is, gosh, like, when people say like, oh, that's so gay, I'll be like, oh, it's hetero or homosexual? Like, tell me how many, how you know, like, how do you know that it's queer? Getting a group to help could be saying like, hey, patrons, like, do you see that person over there? Can you go help her out? Or you could be like, hey, fellow coworkers, like, let's action plan, and like maybe I'll take the woman who's causing the harassment and you check in on the dude who looks really uncomfortable. And that sort of like group delegation is really helpful. The silent stare, y'all are generally really good at. In-person workshops, I have you do this and it's the most frightening thing. I have folks do this. But essentially a silent stare. There's also distraction, like, oh yeah, how was the football game? Or hey, like, I think your friend just walked in, or oops, I just spilled your drink, or like, oh, can I get you another drink? Like, what are you drinking? Do you want some water? That there are ways to intervene that are not always like, hey, stop harassment, but can help diffuse a situation nonetheless. And so altogether, we promote this analysis of the IPA, which is identify, process, and act. So identifying is recognizing that harm is happening. Processing is being able to think of those goals and think of the strategy you want to use. So if my goal is to not make a scene and to get this over quietly, then the strategy I might use is distraction. And so now I'm going to go act and I'm going to try out like, oh, hey, dude, do you want a refill? How about you? And that may in and of itself be enough of an intervention to give people an out or to stop harm from happening. There are other times you may identify different problems. You may process different goals and different strategies and therefore act differently. So I'm just going to go through, one scenario here, and then we'll open it up to questions. So if you want to start commenting away, that'd be great. But for instance, a woman was being hit on repeatedly. She kept moving further and further away, but the male did not stop talking to her. She was way too close physically. He was way too close to her physically. And so the first step in this IPA process would be to identify. There are ways that we can identify that harm is happening because of body language, like moving further and further away, that we are hearing someone being hit on, and it looks like an encroachment of personal space. So then there are like lots of options that we could choose. And so I'm going to invite you to think for a second about what goals you have in mind and how you may choose to respond. What tactic, if you saw this happening, might you use? In this real scenario from our survey, what ended up happening is a bartender stepped in and said, "Hey, I think your boyfriend just walked in and grabbed a table upstairs." So this seemingly worked. And the way that this is a form of distraction. It's a demonstration of a bartender taking initiative and action and being able to separate the two. There are certain goals that prioritize different needs of different people. For instance, if the bartender in this scenario had the goal of, I want the woman who's being hit on to have like the number one experience that she wants, then an intervention may have been structured that helped the male leave the space. So you'll notice that in this intervention, the bartender made it so that the woman had to leave the space that she was in. It still works. It's still a bystander intervention. All intervention is good intervention. But just again, thinking about what goals are we prioritizing and how do we want to use strategies that help meet those goals. And with that, I think I'm done talking at y'all. If you have any thoughts or questions, I'm happy to take them. And Andrew, if you have thoughts or questions for me, I'm also happy to answer them.
No, Brenna, I'll jump in and join you for a moment. Thank you for sharing all of that. I love your use of humor. I mean, it's a very tough topic you dove into the past hour. So you made it really interesting and, actually fun to watch. So not that I didn't expect that, but your personality definitely helped make it really approachable.
Thank you.
Now, for any of our members who are interested in contacting you or perhaps, interested in starting a program at their brewery where they can take steps to, better the overall experience, what do you recommend they do?
Yeah, that's a great question. So you can learn more about us at makeyourmovemissoula.org, where, again, I can help find the rape prevention educators in your area. I think the other piece of this, and we didn't cover this today, is thinking about things like policy and also having staff meetings where you kind of open the door to have these conversations. One of the things about doing trainings like this is that, I come in with some level of knowledge about the law and about what sexual violence is, but it's the bar staff and the brewery staff that know what it's like to work in these settings. And half of the time, I give these presentations, and really what is needed is staff just to have a space to talk, to be able to be like, hey, yeah, actually this regular has been kind of an issue. Can we all problem solve this together? Or, hey, can we re-update our 86 policy? Because I'm not sure that the 3 strikes before 86ing is working for us, and being able to have those conversations to some extent doesn't necessarily require a full workshop. I think a workshop is great. Obviously, it's what I do for a living. And I think there's a lot to learn and to talk about and to navigate. And I also know that resources are sometimes really limited. And if you're not in a community that is offering stuff like this or has the capacity to take this on, that can be really hard. But you can reach out to me. There's a contact, again, on our website, makeyourmovemissoula.org. And just know that as a manager or as an owner, hopefully you have skills to help problem solve with your staff already. And this is just an extension of that problem solving.
That's awesome insight, Brenna. And I think, like you mentioned, just having the conversation and drawing awareness to the issues is a place to start. And I really hope, through conversations like this and people like you just sharing your knowledge, we can make a better craft beer industry. So I thank you again for being here, hanging out today, sharing your expertise, and enjoy the rest of your evening, everybody. Talk to you soon.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.